guys, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm talking about the best horror books I read in 2021. So this year I read 54 books, which is good for me. It's amazing for me because my goal was 50, so I did it. The longest book I read this year was Naomi by Junji Ito, and the most popular book I read this year was Pet Sematary by Stephen King. So let's get into my favorite books. This year I read The Exorcist for the first time, and it quickly became one of my favorite books. This is a story about a young girl who becomes possessed by the devil. This book was a disturbing, thought-provoking read about good versus evil, man's fight for faith, loss of innocence, and feelings of guilt and regret that can come with certain life decisions that you make. I really loved the characters in this book so much, especially Father Karras. I feel that ultimately The Exorcist is really his story and his struggle to find his faith or find his meaning in life, his purpose in life. He has a lot of inner turmoil and a lot of regret for how he handled his relationship with his mother. So he's really struggling, and we really see his character grow and find his true peace through this horrific event that's happening to this little girl. I think that this book is really graphic at times, and it has some truly horrific scenes featuring a little girl that I've ever read. I feel like the book is almost more disturbing than the movie, but they're both so good. Another book I was surprised by how much I loved this year was Jaws. So Jaws, the film, is one of my favorite movies of all time, and I knew that the book was very different. There are subplots in the book that aren't in the movie, and for good reason, because they're terrible. So Jaws centers on a small island town that is being terrorized by a great white shark. This is another story about man versus evil, I would say. It's Chief Brody's story, his struggle to keep his town safe and make the right decisions, and he teams up with Hopper, who is a marine biologist. He's this cocky marine biologist. And then there's Quint, who is the rambunctious fisherman. He's like the Ahab to Moby Dick. He has a grudge for some reason. I don't know what it is. I can't remember if there was a reason. The things that I didn't like about the book were the characters are kind of unlikable in comparison to the films, and they don't really vibe very well together. What they did well in the movie was they made Chief Brody and Hopper more of a team and a partnership, and in the book they explored some things I didn't really like, and also we don't get Quint a lot in the book. What the book does well is the action and the anticipation of the shark. The shark attacks are brilliantly done. They are filled with so much tension and suspense, and they're horrifying. I wish the book was just, if the book would have been a 5-star read for me if it cut out the whole second half and featured more of the shark action. That's my biggest issue with Jaws, the book. It doesn't feature the shark a lot. But it was still a fun read. I'm glad I finally read it. I still think the movie's better. The next book I read was Carmilla. I loved this book so much. It is centered around a young woman who is essentially telling a story through diary entries of this mysterious woman who comes into their lives and disrupts it in a major way. She's a vampire. She's a vampire. And when this woman enters their lives, there's also a series of unexplained deaths that are happening all around them. There was just a lot of dread in this book. There's just a lot of secrets in this, and you don't get a lot of things answered, but I think that the storytelling is really great, and it's just so atmospheric and filled with dread. I just felt so uncomfortable, particularly scenes where she's describing being in her room at night. There's some terrifying scenes that really jumped out at me and scared me, and they're subtle. They're not over the top, and I think that's what I love so much about this, is that it was subtle and it leaves a lot to the imagination, and stories that do that I think are more terrifying than stories that are like in your face terrifying with jump scares. I highly recommend it. It's short and it predates Dracula. How freaking cool is that? Another favorite book of the year is Pet Sematary. I finally read Pet Sematary this year. Pet Sematary centers around a family who moves into this house by a really busy road in Maine, and they experience a horrific family tragedy, and there's a pet cemetery nearby where you bury things there and they come back, but they don't come back the same. It's one of Stephen King's most popular stories. It is a pretty disturbing read. It's just filled with so much sorrow and sadness and just a heaviness. I felt so heavy when I was reading this book. It was such a moving read, and it really makes you question life and death. It makes you think about people in your life that you might lose soon and how would you react in that situation. And I think that Stephen King does a brilliant job at creating such real characters who are expressing real emotions. It's hard to watch as Lewis goes through the stages of grief, and he's trying everything in his heart to do the right thing, or what he thinks is the right thing. And it's just a really difficult read, and I think it's more difficult if you have lost someone in your life, because it all just feels so real. And the ending is one of the best endings I've ever read, especially from a Stephen King novel. It's just a gut punch. The next on my favorites of the year list is Friend by Diana Henstel. This is a book from the 1980s, and it centers around a young boy who's kind of a genius prodigy, and he and his mother move to this new town, or they relocate to this new town after some tragic events happened at their old town, and they're trying to start over fresh. And the young boy meets the girl next door, and he basically falls in love with her. She becomes his best friend, and unfortunately that young girl dies in a tragic way, and the boy brings her back to life. This is a modern day Frankenstein story. It is super dark, especially when you consider that it's dealing with kids, and I think that's one of the things that makes it so heartbreaking for me, is that it is centered around kids who are experiencing horrific things, and it's about loneliness and friendship, and it really does a great job at detailing the lengths that some people will go in order to save a friendship or avoid losing something in their life. It's very similar in the sense of Pet Semetary. They're both very similar, where they deal with grief and loss and not accepting a loss and making horrible decisions to bring somebody back from the dead, and the horrifying consequences that come with that. Another favorite of mine from this year is Crossroads by Laurel Hightower. I'm seeing a pattern as I'm talking about this. So Crossroads details a mother who lost her son tragically, and she hasn't really been able to accept his loss, and she visits his gravesite every night, and she realizes that she can bring him back somehow, but it comes with a catch. She can't just bring him back in a happy way. She's got to shed some blood to bring her son back each night, and it's killing her. This story is very bleak and sad, and it's another story centered on loss and grief. I love stories that center on loss and grief, clearly. This one, I think, does a really good job at showing how blinded you can be by your grief, especially when you're given a chance to have that person in your life again. But I think Laurel Hightower, she writes so beautifully, and it's just such a moving story, and I recommend it for everybody, especially if you like Pet Semetary. It's very similar to Pet Semetary. The next book on my favorites list is Scanlines by Todd Keisling. This book, okay, so this book is about a group of young kids who are searching for, I believe it's a sex tape. It takes place in the 90s, so they're scouring the web for a sex video, whatever, and they accidentally come across this infamous tape of a man committing suicide. This tape is cursed. This curse follows them all throughout their lives. It is a dark read. It has disturbing imagery, and it's not an easy read, but I loved it. I love the whole element of it taking place in the 90s and using the internet. I love stuff that is set around media. It felt very similar to The Ring to me, where it's this cursed tape that follows you and you can't escape it. There's just some really shocking scenes that are upsetting to read. So I recommend checking trigger warnings for this book and all of the books I'm recommending, because they all have some pretty dark themes, but I really enjoy this one, and it's another quick read. Another book I loved this year was A House at the Bottom of a Lake by Josh Mallerman. This book centers on two kids who are going on a first date on a lake, and they discover this perfectly preserved house underwater. So they dive down and check it out, and things are weird. This is a coming of age story with a twist, and it's just an incredibly eerie read. Things that are centered around water just upset me to begin with. There's so many things that can go wrong just with being underwater, but when you add being in this strange house, it's just this added element of tension and dread, and it creeped me out. It really creeped me out, and I highly recommend it. It's a quick read, and it's fun. Another book I love this year is When Darkness Loves Us. It centers on a pregnant woman who gets trapped underground and she has to survive the elements. And it is a super claustrophobic, disturbing read with some just haunting imagery. And I would say that this is comparable to The Descent in the sense that it's very claustrophobic, they're underground, and this person has to survive. And it's one of those reads that will take your breath away because you can just envision yourself being in this situation. How would I survive in this situation? It's dark. I can't breathe very well. I can't see. How am I going to survive? It's super, super unsettling, and the writing is just beautiful and very immersive. So I really love this one. Another book I loved this year was Naomi's Room. This is another ghost story. This is centered around a man who loses his daughter, and they end up finding that she was killed on Christmas Eve. And he's detailing the events that happened via diary entry to us, and he's living in the house that he shared with his wife and his daughter who has disappeared, and he's experiencing some paranormal activity, and it might not be his daughter that's coming to visit him from the supernatural world. And it's just very slow and methodical, and it's super subtle, and it's just slow. It's a slow ascent into madness until it just ramps up the craziness towards the end. It is batshit, but the whole buildup is incredible. There's so much tension and dread. It is so atmospheric, and it actually creeped me out while I was reading it. Like, I read it at night and I actually got scared. If you like slow burning ghost stories, you need to check this one out. The next book I loved this year was None Shall Sleep. This is a YA thriller that is, I would say, Silence of the Lambs meets Mindhunter. It centers on two young FBI recruits who are called in to help interview teenage serial killers. And there's this serial killer on the loose that they're trying to catch. So they send in this young team to interview an infamous teenage serial killer who is kind of like Hannibal Lecter to get some tips and feedback to help them solve this ongoing case. It is a truly disturbing read. It did not feel like it was written for young adults. It is perfect for fans of true crime. I could not put this book down. I'm a huge Mindhunter fan, so it truly felt just like Mindhunter. The whole true crime element of this book is perfect. And then when they get into the stuff, it's very disturbing. It's very graphic. I was honestly shocked, but I love this story. I love that they don't push the two main characters into a romantic relationship, and I'm hoping we get a sequel because I would read about these kids interviewing teenage serial killers for the rest of my life. It's so good. And my last favorite book of 2021 is The Betrayal, which is a Fear Street book. So I read the Fear Street books. I started reading them again as we were coming close to the premiere of the new Fear Street trilogy on Netflix, and I read The Betrayal, which is a part of the Fear Street saga. It's focused on this girl who is in love with this boy, and his father doesn't want him to have a relationship with her because he's supposed to marry somebody else. So the father accuses this girl and her mother of being witches, and it sets off this whole feud between two families that lasts decades, and it is really setting up the story behind why Shadyside is the way that it is, why so many bad things happen in Shadyside. And I thought it was so well written. It felt a lot more adult in comparison to other Fear Street books. It was graphic, where there's characters who are being burned at the stake. It was just a very well written story, and it was the best Fear Street book I've read so far. I just really enjoyed it, and I am super excited to just read more Fear Street. But I think that's one that if you want to get started, this is the one to start with, because it's setting the landscape for you. And there you have it. Those are some of my favorite reads of 2021. I didn't read a ton of new books this year. I like to focus on older books that have been on my TBR forever, and I'm trying to make my way slowly through the classics, which I have been doing. So yeah, I'm hoping to get to some of my newer published books like The Final Girl Support Group, My Heart is a Chainsaw. Those have been on my list, but I didn't have the time. So let me know what books you read this year that you absolutely loved, and thank you so much for watching, guys. I will catch you next time. Bye.